You ready for a deep dive into Genesis? Chapter 25, specifically. It's often overlooked, but you'll see why it's packed with fascinating details. We're past Sarah's passing, and Abraham has a new wife, Keturah, and a bunch more kids. It's like the next chapter of God's promise to make him a father of many nations, but this time, there's a whole lot of strategy mixed in.
What's fascinating here is how this chapter doesn't just list names and dates. It shows us Abraham actively living out the covenant with God and ensuring its legacy. It's in the subtle details, like the way he sends Keturah's children away with gifts.
Let's unpack that. On the surface, it might seem a little dismissive, but there's more to it.
Absolutely. This is Abraham demonstrating a deep understanding of God's promises. Remember, God's promise wasn't just about descendants, but about a specific lineage inheriting the spiritual blessing. By sending these sons away, Abraham was making sure there was no question about Isaac being the primary heir to that covenant.
It's like he was placing his trust in God's timing, right? He knew God would fulfill the father of many nations, part through Keturah's sons, but the spiritual covenant was meant for Isaac.
Exactly, and the text highlights this by mentioning the land of Kedem, where they were sent. Kedem means continuation or progress. It's a subtle detail, but it shows Abraham saw this as a step forward for God's plan, not a setback.
I never caught that. Abraham's really got his strategic inheritance planning down. Now, let's talk about legacies. We see Abraham die at 175 years old. It says he died satisfied. He had a long, fruitful life, but there's more to that word satisfied than just a good, long life.
You're right. The Hebrew word sabea is often translated as full of years, but satisfied gets at the core of Abraham's faith. He wasn't clinging to unfulfilled promises. He died knowing that God's promises would unfold in his time because Abraham trusted in God's unwavering commitment.
And what about Ishmael being at the burial? It's a small detail, but it feels significant.
It really does. It reminds us of the complex relationship between Ishmael and Isaac, reflecting that tension between physical and spiritual lineage that we saw with Hagar and Sarah. We see God blessed Ishmael with a long life and 12 sons, fulfilling the promise he made to Hagar. But the text makes a point of saying Ishmael was gathered to his people, not Abraham's. It's a subtle but important distinction.
So he has a legacy, but it's separate from the covenant promise given to Isaac.
Right. And it's interesting to consider where Ishmael's descendants settled towards Egypt and Assyria. These empires often represent worldliness in the Bible, which contrasts with the spiritual inheritance passed down through Isaac.
It's incredible how even geography plays a role in this unfolding narrative. Speaking of which, let's talk about Isaac and Rebekah. They have their own echoes of Abraham and Sarah's story, don't they?
Definitely. They struggle to conceive, and then twins. But these aren't just any twins. Even in the womb, there's conflict.
It's like their story is setting us up for the drama that will unfold between their sons.
Exactly. And God acknowledges this, telling Rebekah, 2 nations are in your womb. The older will serve the younger. This statement goes against societal norms and emphasizes that God's plans don't always fit our expectations.
And then we meet those sons. Esau, the hunter who seems driven by his physical needs, and Jacob, the quiet one.
And those descriptions aren't accidental. The text describes Jacob as tam, which means more than just quiet. It suggests a recognition of his own limitations and a dependence on something greater.
It makes you wonder if that awareness is part of what makes Jacob suitable for carrying the covenant forward.
It's a good question. Then we have the birthright scene. Esau comes in, famished, and trades his birthright for some stew. It's almost comical, but also a bit sad.
It's a pivotal moment, and the word used to describe Esau's hunger, ayaf, suggests he was near death. Some might say Jacob took advantage of the situation.
It's easy to see it that way. But remember, the birthright wasn't just about material possessions. It represented spiritual leadership, a responsibility to be a conduit for God's blessings. Esau, so focused on his immediate need, dismissed the weight of that responsibility. Jacob, on the other hand, saw an opportunity to step into that role, to try and fulfill the covenant promise.
So it wasn't just about a bowl of stew for Jacob?
Not at all. It was about recognizing the significance of the birthright and taking the opportunity to pursue what he believed was his role in God's plan. It makes you think, if God had already chosen Jacob, why even have the birthright exchange?
It's interesting, isn't it? God already has a plan, but then there's this interplay of choice and consequence.
Yeah.
It's like the birthright exchange is this pivotal moment that highlights the different paths Esau and Jacob are on.
Right.
But it also makes you wonder about God's grace in the midst of it all.
That's an important point. It's easy to get caught up in the drama, but there's a bigger picture here. Remember, Even though Esau traded his birthright, God still affirmed his blessing on him in other ways.
Which brings us back to something we've seen throughout this deep dive, God's faithfulness to his promises, even when things get complicated.
Exactly. And it reminds us to look beyond the surface level to those seemingly insignificant choices that can have long-term consequences, both for us and for generations to come.
It makes you think about our own lives, doesn't it? How often do we find ourselves caught between pursuing immediate gratification and trusting in God's timing, in his plan for us?
It's a tension we all face. Genesis chapter 25 doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it invites us into the complexities of faith, choice, and God's unwavering faithfulness. As we finish our deep dive, it's worth reflecting on those choices we're making today. Are they driven by fleeting desires, or are they aligned with the deeper purpose God has for us, even if we can't fully see it yet?
Lots to think about. Thanks for diving deep with me into Genesis chapter 25.